I found my husband seducing my own mother. I should have stayed with you. You know how to satisfy me, not like your dumb daughter, he said as he stroked her leg. I couldn't control myself or contain my rage, so minutes later, I decided to take revenge on these two traitors. Samantha was in the kitchen, the sound of her knife echoing as it cut the carrots on the wooden board. The soft click mixed with the ticking of the clock hanging on the wall, marking time that seemed to stand still. Outside, a light rain tapped on the windows, enveloping the house in an atmosphere of tranquility, almost too perfect to be real. She was preparing dinner for herself and Luis Ernesto, her husband, as she had done so many times before. But this time, something inside her felt different. There was a restlessness she couldn't explain. She paused for a moment, letting the knife drop as her eyes turned toward the half-open door leading to the living room. She heard voices, soft but recognizable. It was her mother Samira's laugh, followed by a low murmur from Luis Ernesto. At first, she didn't pay much attention. Her mother would visit from time to time, and Luis Ernesto had always been cordial with her. But something in the tone of their conversation made her stop. Samantha felt a pang of discomfort. What are they laughing about? She thought, with a mix of curiosity and distrust. She walked slowly toward the living room door, her hands still wet from washing the vegetables. As she peeked in, her heart stopped. There they were, Luis Ernesto and Samira on the sofa, far too close to each other. Luis Ernesto's hand rested on Samira's leg in a way that had nothing to do with cordiality. Samantha held her breath, her legs trembled, but she remained still, trapped between disbelief and the growing rage beginning to boil inside her. Luis Ernesto leaned toward Samira, and Samantha heard clearly the words that tore her soul apart. I should have stayed with you, whispered Luis Ernesto to her mother, his voice vibrating with desire. You know how to satisfy me, not like your dumb daughter. Samantha felt the air leave her body. Her world, everything she believed to be safe, shattered in that moment. A mixture of disgust, rage, and pain pierced her like a knife. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry. The words wouldn't come, and her body felt paralyzed. Her own mother, her husband. The two people she trusted most had betrayed her in the lowest way possible. The scene before her eyes consumed her, but Samantha couldn't move. When she finally managed to back away, she did so silently, like a shadow disappearing. She returned to the kitchen, her hands trembling. The knife was still on the cutting board, the carrots half chopped. But now, the last thing she wanted was to prepare dinner. The last thing she wanted was to see their faces. However, she knew she would soon have to face them. Samantha leaned against the sink, taking deep breaths, trying to control the rage consuming her. The betrayal was so deep she couldn't fully process it. How had this happened? When? How had she not seen this coming? She remembered the happy moments she had shared with Luis Ernesto, the romantic dinners, the promises of eternal love. It all felt like a farce, a carefully constructed lie. Samantha's phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her out of her daze. It was a message from Luis Ernesto. Love, I'll be a little busy with your mom. Why don't you rest for a while? I love you. That last I love you was the final blow. Samantha clenched her fists until her knuckles turned white. The heat of fury enveloped her, and a torrent of dark thoughts filled her mind. What should she do? Confront them? Scream in their faces? No. Something inside her, a colder, more calculating voice, whispered a different idea. She couldn't lose control. She couldn't let them see how much they had hurt her. If she was going to face them, it would be on her terms. And that way, she knew immediately would be through revenge. As she looked at the knife on the cutting board, an idea began to take shape in her mind. It wouldn't be a direct confrontation. That would be too easy for them. Samantha was going to make them suffer. She would play the same game they were playing, but with one difference. She would win. She straightened up, drying her hands with the kitchen towel, and an unnatural calm washed over her. All the pain, all the suffering she had felt in the past few minutes was transforming into something colder and more controlled. Samantha was no longer the betrayed woman, Now she was the woman who was going to regain control. There was a lot to plan, a lot to uncover. How will I do this? She asked herself, her mind already beginning to map out the first steps of her revenge. She would have to move carefully, calculating every move. She couldn't rush. Luis Ernesto and her mother didn't know that she had discovered their betrayal, and she would use that advantage to her favor. That night, Samantha slept little. In her mind, images of Luis Ernesto and Samira haunted her like a bad dream, but a new resolution also kept her company. She had learned the lesson of betrayal, and now she would use it to her advantage. She wasn't the same woman who had stood in that kitchen earlier in the day. Something inside her had changed, and this new version of Samantha wouldn't rest until she made them both pay. Dawn came, and with it, the calm before the storm. She knew she would have to see them again, smile, and pretend that everything was fine. She knew she would have to swallow the disgust and rage for a while, but that would only make the revenge even sweeter when the time was right. As she descended the stairs to prepare breakfast, Samantha was no longer the same. In her eyes, there was a spark that hadn't been there before, the spark of power. She knew she was going to win this game. She knew that, in the end, Luis Ernesto and Samira would face the consequences of their actions. And that thought, for the first time since discovering the betrayal, brought her a small, dark satisfaction. The revenge had begun, though they didn't know it yet. Samantha woke up the next day with the same feeling of emptiness that had followed her throughout the night. The echo of Luis Ernesto's words resounded in her mind, but there was something deeper that kept her uneasy. That betrayal hadn't just broken her, it had forced her to remember something she had tried to bury for years, her own history with Luis Ernesto, a story she had preferred to forget. He hadn't only betrayed her with her mother. He had always been a man with shadows, but now those shadows took on a different meaning. While making coffee, Samantha leaned on the counter, her hands wrapped around the warm cup, as if that warmth could ease the cold she felt in her chest. She had met Luis Ernesto when she was 17, long before he entered her life in the way he later did. She saw him as an older man, full of experience, attractive, and with an intimidating confidence. For Samantha, he had been an unattainable love, someone who made her feel invisible, but still, she admired him from afar. At that time, Luis Ernesto was involved in a passionate relationship with a woman who, according to him, had abandoned him. Samantha would listen to him talk about this woman, not knowing that he was talking about her mother. She never imagined that this story would be the beginning of a plan that would pull her in years later. That relationship he lamented so much, that broken heart he claimed to carry, wasn't just a failed romance. It was the seed of the revenge that now enveloped her. Luis Ernesto had returned to her life casually, years after that first encounter. Their reunion felt almost like an act of fate, or at least that's what Samantha believed at the time. She was already an adult woman, and he, though still marked by the scars of the past, seemed calmer. The attraction between them was immediate, or at least, that's what she felt. But now everything seemed different. Was that attraction real, or was it simply part of a game he had started long before she realized? When they got married, Samantha thought she had found the love of her life. Luis Ernesto made her feel special, unique. However, now she realized that everything was tainted by a shadow she hadn't wanted to see. It was as if every gesture, every word, had been a mask he used to hide something deeper. Her marriage, that refuge she had built with so much care, had been just another piece in the board of revenge he had planned from the beginning. That morning, as the coffee cooled in her hands, Samantha realized she needed to know the whole truth. She couldn't base her revenge solely on the betrayal of that moment. She had to understand the roots of everything. And for that, she had to unearth the past. Luis Ernesto wasn't going to reveal the truth on his own. She knew that. But she knew someone who would. "Mom," she said aloud, as her plan began to take shape. Samira was the key to unraveling that labyrinth of lies. Although she hated her for what she had done, Samantha knew that her mother had answers she needed. There were secrets that had been buried in the past, and now it was time to bring them to light. But she had to be cautious. She couldn't ruin her plan by showing her cards too soon. Later that same afternoon, she decided to visit her mother. She walked into Samira's house with a fake smile, hiding the storm that raged within her. Samira greeted her with her usual elegance, that carefree attitude that had irritated Samantha so much over the years. It seemed that the betrayal didn't weigh on her shoulders, at least not as it should. "What a surprise to see you, daughter," Samira said with a light smile as she offered her a glass of wine. "I needed to talk to you, Mom. I want to ask you something about the past," Samantha responded without hesitation, controlling the anger that threatened to spill over. Samira raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "About what exactly?" she asked, sipping the wine with elegance, as if she were immune to any kind of tension. Samantha took a deep breath, making sure her tone was right. "About Luis Ernesto. You knew him before he and I were together, didn't you? You've always said you didn't know much about him, but something tells me that's not the whole truth." There was a slight change in Samira's expression. It was almost imperceptible, but Samantha noticed. Her mother had always been a cold, calculating woman, but for a second, she seemed to lose control of her mask. "Well, of course I knew him. He was a family friend at the time, but I don't know what you're implying." "He chose you, not me," she replied defensively. Samantha observed her in silence for a few seconds, measuring her words. "You know I'm not talking about friendship, Mom. You and Luis Ernesto, you had something, didn't you?" Samira set the glass down on the table, her smile disappearing completely. The silence that followed was deafening. For a few moments, neither of them spoke, but the tension was palpable. Finally, Samira sighed, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "You wouldn't understand," Samira said with a bitter tone. "Luis Ernesto was important to me, yes. But it was so long ago that I thought it didn't matter anymore." "Doesn't matter?" Samantha's voice began to rise, the anger she had been holding and threatening to explode. "He's my husband. Of course it matters." Samira remained calm, as if her daughter's fury didn't affect her. "Luis Ernesto loved me, but I left him. I made decisions that at the time I thought were right. I didn't know he would come back and marry you, and I certainly didn't imagine he would cling to that old story." Samantha couldn't believe the coldness with which her mother talked about it, as if it were just a trivial detail from the past. "Why didn't you ever tell me anything?" Samantha asked, feeling as if the ground was falling out from under her feet. Samira looked at her, finally revealing some humanity in her eyes. "Because, Samantha, some things are better left buried. But it seems that Luis Ernesto didn't do that." Samantha left her mother's house feeling like she had entered a maze with no way out. The truth was beginning to unfold, but with every answer, more questions arose. Luis Ernesto hadn't just used her. Their entire marriage had been a twisted revenge against Samira. And now, Samantha was in the middle of that storm, not knowing how to stop it. However, one thing was clear. She wasn't going to be just another piece in this game. If Luis Ernesto wanted to play, now Samantha would play too, but by her own rules. Samantha returned home after her conversation with Samira, feeling trapped in an increasingly intricate web of lies. The weight of the revelations crushed her. Luis Ernesto hadn't come into her life by chance. He had planned to marry her as part of a twisted revenge against her mother. Now, she understood that everything she had believed to be true for years was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. But what she still didn't fully understand was the depth of that hatred. And that only motivated her more to uncover it. She sat on the chair in her living room, her mind wandering to the moment when it all might have started. Samira had left Luis Ernesto for another man. She hadn't mentioned the details, but Samantha understood perfectly what that meant. Her mother, always pragmatic, had chosen someone with more power, more influence. And as she had done so many times before, she hadn't looked back. Samantha needed to know more. She couldn't settle for the scraps Samira had given her. She went to the desk in the study and pulled out a memory box, one of those she kept with clippings and photographs of her mother's life before she was born. Among the black and white photos of luxurious parties and social gatherings, she found an image of a young Samira, radiant, standing next to a man she didn't recognize. It wasn't her father. The man, imposing in appearance, wore an elegant suit and looked at Samira with a mixture of admiration and possession. Samantha knew, without needing to be told, that this was the man her mother had left Luis Ernesto for. But there was more. A second photo, much more revealing, left her frozen. In the next image, Luis Ernesto appeared in the background of a party, watching Samira from afar, with an expression that said everything: pain, fury, and a desire that hadn't died. He had been there, watching as she gave herself to another man. He had witnessed the moment Samira left him behind. That moment seemed to be the catalyst for everything that followed. Samantha realized that what Luis Ernesto felt wasn't just resentment. It was an obsession, fueled by years of unhealed wounds. Samantha picked up the phone and dialed Luis Ernesto's number. She wasn't going to wait any longer. She needed to confront him, even if indirectly. It wasn't time to show all her cards, but it was time to start pulling at the threads. After a few rings, he answered, his voice calm, as if nothing had changed between them. "Hi, love, is everything okay?" he asked, as if he didn't suspect the hurricane of emotions swirling in Samantha's mind. "I want to talk to you, Luis Ernesto," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though the anger threatened to spill over. "Tonight at home." He paused, as if evaluating her tone, but didn't seem alarmed. "Of course. What's it about?" he replied with the same calm. "You'll find out soon. I just want you to be on time." She hung up without giving him a chance to say more. That night, as she waited in the living room, thoughts swirled around her. She remembered how Luis Ernesto had reappeared in her life after so many years apart. She remembered their first conversations, the romantic gestures that had seemed genuine. And now, all those memories were tinged with a cynicism that made her stomach turn. Luis Ernesto had seen her as an opportunity to get back at Samira. From the very beginning, she had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. When the front door opened, Samantha tensed. Luis Ernesto walked in with a warm smile on his lips, the same smile that had once made her feel safe. But now, that smile only filled her with distrust. He approached her, trying to kiss her on the forehead as he used to, but Samantha pulled away. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low, controlled by the anger she was holding back. Luis Ernesto sat down across from her, frowning. "What's going on, Samantha?" he asked, his tone careful but tinged with concern. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain the calm that was so hard to hold onto. "I know what happened between you and my mother. I know you loved her, and I know she left you for another man." The words hung in the air, heavy, laden with truth. Luis Ernesto remained motionless, as if he had been caught. For a few seconds, the silence was absolute. He didn't deny anything, didn't bother to feign surprise. Instead, a shadow crossed his face, a mixture of resignation and something darker, almost a twisted satisfaction. "So, you know," he said finally, his voice low, almost soft. Samantha leaned toward him, her eyes piercing into his, searching for answers. "Did you ever love me, Luis Ernesto? Or was all of this just a way to get back at her?" she asked, each word coming out with painful precision. Luis Ernesto looked at her intently, his face showing a mix of complex emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice devoid of emotion. "At first, Samantha, I thought I could forget her. I thought that with you, I could start over. But when I found out you were her daughter, I couldn't help it. Everything came back, the resentment, the fury, everything." He shrugged, as if explaining something he couldn't even control himself. "I can't say I didn't love you. But over time, I realized that marrying you gave me the opportunity to settle the score." Samantha felt her heart break again, but this time it wasn't the pain of betrayal that made her tremble. It was the cold calculation behind every word Luis Ernesto spoke. He had used her love as a weapon. It had all been a perfectly orchestrated game, and she had fallen into it without even realizing. "So, all of this was to hurt her?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Her voice cracked slightly, but she forced herself to stay strong. Luis Ernesto sighed, looking at her with a mixture of sadness and coldness. Not just that. When she left me for that man, she didn't just lose someone who loved her. She humiliated me, Samantha. She made me feel insignificant, like I wasn't enough. And when I saw you, when I realized who you were, I saw an opportunity, not just to hurt her, but to take back control. To feel like, finally, I had the power. Samantha felt a lump in her throat. Luis Ernesto's words were cold, like blow after blow. Now she understood the true reason behind it all. It wasn't just about revenge for lost love. It was about power, pride, about a man who couldn't bear being rejected. And you didn't care about destroying me in the process, she whispered, feeling the tears threaten to spill. But she wasn't going to cry in front of him. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Luis Ernesto looked at her, his expression showing no regret, but a kind of resignation. Samantha, what happened between us, it was real. But my hatred for Samira was always there, and unfortunately, it caught up with us. Samantha stood up, feeling like the air in the room was suffocating. Everything was clearer now, but that didn't make her feel any better. In fact, the truth tore her apart even more. Luis Ernesto wasn't just a man who had betrayed her. He was someone who had built his life on a foundation of lies and manipulation. "This isn't over, Luis Ernesto," she said, looking at him directly. "You think you're in control, but you don't know who you're dealing with." He watched her, and for the first time, he saw something in Samantha's eyes that unsettled him, a resolution he hadn't expected. That same night, after the tense conversation with Luis Ernesto, Samantha found herself alone in her bedroom, sitting on the bed, trying to process everything she had discovered. The pain of betrayal still burned in her chest, but beneath that anger was a growing sense of clarity. The pieces were starting to fit together, though important details were still missing. Luis Ernesto had been driven by his obsession with her mother, and once again, Samira had shown her ability to destroy everything around her with her calculating coldness. But Samantha was not willing to fall into that same cycle of betrayals. This time, she would set the rules. In the midst of her thoughts, she heard a soft sound, like an envelope sliding under the front door. She cautiously stood up, crossing the house in silence until she reached the hallway. There, on the floor, she saw a plain white envelope with no return address. Samantha's heart began to race. Who would send her a letter at this hour? Intrigue pushed her to pick it up, her breath heavy with anticipation. She walked back to the living room and sat in front of the fireplace, opening the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper inside was rough, as if someone had wanted to ensure it wasn't just a simple message. The first line left her frozen. "Your mother hasn't told you the whole truth about your brother." Samantha felt the world stop for a moment. "Brother?" She frowned, trying to process what she was reading. The letter continued, written in a messy scrawl, as if the person writing had been anxious or rushed. "Samira had a son before you. A son who didn't die at birth like you were told. He was sold. The truth is in the secrets your mother has carefully guarded, but if you want to know more, you'll have to find out for yourself." The air left her lungs in a long exhale. Her entire body tensed. The possibility of having an older brother, someone her mother had deliberately hidden, was too much to process immediately. She tried to remember the few times Samira had spoken of her past before she was born. It was always vague, as if she avoided unnecessary details. But now it all made sense. Samira had hidden something huge, and Samantha knew her mother wouldn't be easy to question about this. Samira was too skilled at hiding secrets. Samantha stood up, still holding the letter, unable to stay still. What should she do? Her mother wasn't someone who could be easily confronted, not without more information. But the idea of having a lost brother, someone who had been sold like an object, was simply inconceivable. Everything she knew about her mother was unraveling, revealing a much more sinister and painful truth. With the letter trembling in her hand, she decided she couldn't wait. She headed to Samira's house, furious and determined to get answers. The night was dark, and the light drizzle seemed to match her growing frustration. When she arrived, she knocked on the door forcefully. The sound echoed through the silent house until, finally, her mother opened the door, wrapped in a silk robe, surprised to see her. "Samantha? What are you doing here at this hour?" asked Samira, though the slight alarm in her voice didn't go unnoticed. Samantha entered without an invitation, pushing the letter in her mother's face. "What is this? Why did you hide it from me? A brother?" Her voice trembled, but it was loaded with barely contained rage. Samira looked at her with an initially unshaken coldness, but Samantha caught something deeper in her eyes, something only a daughter could recognize: fear. The relentless control she had always seen in her mother was beginning to crumble. "I don't know what you're talking about," Samira said, trying to maintain her composure. But her tone lacked its usual certainty. "Don't lie to me. Not anymore. Did you sell my brother? Did you abandon him?" Samantha was on the verge of tears, the pain of the revelations tearing at her soul. Samira sighed, her shoulders slumping, as if a heavy burden had finally crushed her. "I didn't abandon him. It's not that simple, Samantha." Her voice was tinged with a weariness Samantha had never heard before. Samira seemed more vulnerable than she had ever seen her. "It was a different time. I was young, with no resources, and I made mistakes. When I married your father, I tried to leave all of that behind." "Mistakes?" Samantha replied, incredulous. "We're talking about a person, your own son. How could you just sell him like he was nothing?" Samira closed her eyes for a moment, trying to control her emotions. When she opened them again, a single tear ran down her cheek, a completely new image for Samantha, who had never seen her mother show such humanity. "I had no options. Your brother was born into a situation I couldn't control. Luis Ernesto and we weren't together anymore, and the man I was with after didn't want anything to do with him. I had no means to raise him on my own, so I made the hardest decision of my life. I didn't sell him for money, Samantha. I gave him up for adoption, but I knew the family would take him far, far away." Samantha was paralyzed. She had known her mother to be cold and calculating in many aspects of her life, but she had never thought she was capable of something like this. She couldn't comprehend how anyone could give up a child like that, and worse, how she had kept it a secret for so many years. "How could you hide this from me?" Samantha asked, her voice breaking. "You made me believe I was alone, that I had no other family." Samira shook her head, her face filled with an unexpected sadness. "I did it because I thought it was best for everyone. I thought that if I kept you away from that dark past, you could have a better life. But now I see that I was wrong. Everything is coming to light, and I'm afraid of what will come next." Samantha stepped back, stunned. She knew her life would never be the same after that night. Her mother had lived a life of secrets, building a facade of perfection while burying what had really happened. And now, all that truth had caught up with her. "I'm going to find him," Samantha said with determination. "No matter what it takes. I want to know who my brother is. And I won't stop until I get all the answers." Samira didn't respond. She simply watched her with a mixture of fear and resignation, knowing that she could no longer control what came next. As Samantha left her mother's house, she felt the cold wind on her face. She knew this new search would take her down dark paths her mother had left behind. But she also knew it was necessary. There were more secrets to uncover, and with each step she took, she moved closer to a truth that would change her life forever. Samantha spent days immersed in a frantic search. After the devastating revelation about her lost brother, she couldn't focus on anything else. The idea that she had spent her whole life not knowing that there was someone else in the world who shared her blood tormented her. Her mother had destroyed that connection with lies and abandonment, and now Samantha was determined to uncover every piece of truth she could find. But it wasn't going to be easy. Every step she took brought her closer to the unknown. She consulted adoption records, searched for names and clues, but everything seemed like a dead end. The man her mother described as powerful and uninterested in his son had ensured that any trace of the past was erased. But Samantha wasn't going to give up. She was determined to find her brother, and something inside her told her that this search would not only unearth more secrets, but also change her forever. One morning, as she was going through her mail, Samantha found a gray envelope with no return address, something that made her shudder immediately. The initial jolt transformed into unease. She tore open the envelope with trembling hands, and inside, she found a small note with an address written by hand. There were no other details, just a message in hurried, small letters. "I know what you're looking for. Come alone." Samantha felt a knot in her stomach. Who had sent this note? What did it mean? It was possible that someone knew something about her brother, but the cryptic tone and lack of information heightened her suspicion. However, her desperation for answers pushed her to act. She knew she couldn't tell Luis Ernesto or her mother. This was something she had to face alone. The address led her to the outskirts of the city, to an abandoned industrial area. The buildings were old, worn down by time and neglect. As she approached, her heart beat faster, each step echoing with the anxiety she felt. The shadows of the factories loomed threateningly on the ground, but Samantha kept going. When she reached the exact address, she found a rusty metal door. She knocked hard, and after a few seconds that felt like an eternity, a man opened the door. He was tall, with an unkempt beard and dark eyes that stared at her intensely. There was something familiar in his gaze, though Samantha couldn't quite place what it was. "You're Samantha, right?" the man asked, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. Samantha nodded, keeping her calm despite the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. "Yes, I got a note. Who are you?" she asked, though the answer was already forming in her mind. The man gave a bitter smile, as if he had been expecting that question for years. "I'm the brother you're looking for." The words came out of his mouth with a mixture of resentment and pain. The air in the room grew heavy immediately. Samantha felt the world around her stop. The man in front of her was her brother, the son her mother had hidden, the man who had lived his whole life in the shadows of that secret. She looked at him, searching in his features for some resemblance that would confirm what she had just heard. His eyes, though filled with hardness, reflected a deep sadness that she recognized instantly. She knew that he, too, had suffered. "It can't be," Samantha murmured, taking a step back, trying to absorb the reality. "Yes, Samantha," he said, his voice restrained. "It's me, the son our mother sold. The one who was ripped out of his life and left to be raised by others. My name is Andres. At least, that's what my adoptive parents decided to call me." The coldness in his voice was evident, but so was the underlying pain. Samantha felt a mixture of guilt and compassion. This man, her own brother, had lived a life completely separate from hers. While she grew up with the privileges of a family, albeit a dysfunctional one, Andres had been cast aside, forgotten, as if he didn't matter. Andres. I didn't know anything about this. I found out recently, and all I know is what my mother told me. Samantha tried to find the right words, but none seemed sufficient. He interrupted her with a bitter laugh. "Did Samira tell you the truth?" His eyes pierced her with a fierce intensity. "Or did she just tell you the part that makes her look like the victim? Because that woman," he paused, his anger barely contained, "is much worse than you can imagine." Samantha remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I was torn from her arms like I was a nuisance, sold to a couple who never really loved me. I grew up knowing I didn't belong anywhere, and when I found out who my real mother was, everything started to make sense. Samira didn't just abandon me because of that man's pressure. She did it because I was an obstacle. I always was." "How did you find all of this out?" Samantha asked, her voice strained with the tension of the moment. "I searched for years," Andres replied. "I knew something didn't fit, and when I finally found the clues that led me to Samira, I found you, too." His voice softened slightly, but the pain was still there. "At first, I just wanted answers, but now I don't know what I want. Maybe to see that woman pay for what she did to me." Samantha looked at him, seeing in his eyes the reflection of her own pain. She had been used, too, though in different ways. The weight of Samira's betrayal felt heavier than ever. She knew her mother had made mistakes, but she hadn't imagined they were so deep, so devastating. "I don't know what to say to you," Samantha murmured. I feel like I failed you, like I should have known. Andres watched her in silence for a few seconds, as if evaluating her words. You're not to blame for any of this, Samantha, he said finally. But I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here because I want justice. I want our mother to face what she's done. Not just to me, but to you too. Justice? Samantha asked, confused. Yes, justice. Samira has manipulated our lives from the very beginning. She's controlled both of us. And it's time for that to end. Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. She knew her brother was right. Samira couldn't keep hiding her mistakes or destroying everything she touched. But she also understood that this pursuit of justice could take them to dark places, where the consequences would be unpredictable. What do you propose? She finally asked. Andres looked at her with fierce intensity. We're going to make her confess everything. In front of Luis Ernesto, in front of you, in front of me. We're going to expose all the lies, all the betrayals. And then, we'll see what's left of her perfect world. Samantha wasn't sure if she was ready for what would come next. But one thing was clear, Samira's lies had come to an end. And what would happen next would be devastating. Samantha's house was wrapped in a tense silence. That afternoon, the calm before the storm was palpable. Everything was in its place, but the atmosphere was charged with something darker, the truth that was about to come to light. The pieces were set, the plan outlined. She, Andres, and Luis Ernesto were going to confront Samira, forcing her to admit everything she had done, the lies, the betrayals, the decisions that had destroyed everyone's lives. Samantha didn't know how her mother would react, but Andres was determined to seek justice. As for Luis Ernesto, he was unaware of the plan's details. He only knew that Samantha had something to say, something that involved him and was connected to the past Samira had hidden for so many years. The meeting was arranged in the main living room. Samantha insisted on keeping things as simple as possible. There was no need for grand ceremonies. The truth alone would be enough to shatter what remained intact. Luis Ernesto arrived first. He was dressed with his usual neatness, but there was a certain uncertainty in his eyes. He knew something had been wrong since his last conversation with Samantha, but he wasn't sure what. Samantha, what's going on? He asked as he saw her, trying to hide his discomfort. Samantha looked at him with a mixture of pity and resolve. Despite everything, there was still an echo of the love she had once felt for him, but she also knew that love had been eclipsed by lies and manipulation. Everything you need to know will be revealed soon, Luis Ernesto, she responded calmly. I just need you to listen. Nothing more. Luis Ernesto frowned, but slowly nodded. At that moment, Andres appeared in the doorway, his presence adding a new layer of tension to the room. Luis Ernesto looked at him with confusion. Who is he? He asked, his tone slightly defensive, as if sensing he was about to be pushed into an uncomfortable truth. Samantha looked at Andres, who stood at the threshold, his eyes fixed on Luis Ernesto, assessing the man who had been part of his mother's life and now his sister's. This is Andres, said Samantha, trying to keep her voice steady. My brother. The son my mother has hidden all these years. Luis Ernesto's eyes widened in surprise, but before he could formulate a response, the front door swung open. Samira entered, looking as impeccable as ever. She wore an elegant coat and removed her sunglasses with a calculated motion. When she saw Andres, her expression froze. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Samira's eyes locked onto her long-lost sons, and the room filled with a thick, cutting silence. Samira, the woman who had always maintained control, now appeared vulnerable for the first time. What's going on here? Samira asked, her voice softer than usual, but with a sharp edge betraying her nervousness. Andres stepped toward her, his gaze filled with resentment. I think you know exactly what's happening, Mother, said Andres, his final word laced with both contempt and pain. I'm here because you can't hide the truth any longer. Luis Ernesto, still confused, looked at Samira with growing suspicion. What does this mean? Brother? What's happening, Samira? He asked incredulously, beginning to piece things together. Samira maintained her composure, though Samantha noticed how her hands subtly tensed. It was a clear sign that, for the first time, her mother didn't have complete control of the situation. "It's not what it seems," said Samira, trying to regain her usual tone, that voice that always seemed to have the power to persuade anyone. But this time, it wouldn't work. "Andres was a mistake from the past. Something I thought would never come to light." "A mistake?" Andres replied, his voice rising with anger. "Is that what you call it? I was an inconvenience to you. Not a son, not a life. Just a problem you got rid of to continue with your luxurious life, with your lies." Luis Ernesto, who had been silent until that point, abruptly stood up, unable to endure it any longer. "You had a son you didn't tell me about, Samira? You sold your own child?" He looked at her with a mix of disgust and betrayal. "Was this all part of who you are?" Samantha watched the scene with her heart in her throat. Seeing Luis Ernesto confront her mother was a spectacle she had never imagined. The fury in his eyes, the pain he had never shown before, now palpable. Samira, usually so haughty, seemed to shrink under the weight of the accusations. "Luis Ernesto, everything I did was to protect my life, my future. I had no choices at that time," Samira said, her voice trying to sound reasonable but breaking under the pressure. "I did it to survive." Samantha felt something inside her break. Her mother's excuses, always so well-constructed, no longer had any effect. They couldn't protect her anymore. The image of the strong and calculating woman she had projected throughout her life was crumbling before her eyes. "Survive?" Andres repeated, his voice filled with bitter disdain. "You survived at the cost of my life, my identity. You let me grow up not knowing who I was while you built a world of lies." Samira stared at him, her eyes filled with a sadness she had never shown before, a sadness she perhaps didn't even know how to express. "It wasn't that simple, Andres. I was trapped. I did what I thought was best at the time," Samira said, her voice barely a whisper. But Andres didn't want to hear more. His pain was too deep, too old. "I don't want your excuses anymore," he said, stepping back. "I just wanted you to face what you did, to admit what you are." Luis Ernesto, still unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what was happening, looked at Samantha with desperation. "Did you know all this?" he asked, his voice breaking. Samantha shook her head slowly. "I only found out recently. And since I did, nothing has been the same. Now I understand that this family was built on lies. Lies Samira manipulated from the beginning." Her voice was steady but full of pain. "And I don't want to be part of it anymore." Samira, finally defeated, sank into a chair. Her face, once always flawless, now showed signs of vulnerability she had never allowed others to see. She was broken, but even in that moment, Samantha didn't feel pity for her. Only a bitter sense of release. "Everything is falling apart, Mother," Samantha said, stepping closer to her. "You don't have control anymore. And the worst part is, you never really had it." Samira finally lifted her eyes. In them, there was no trace left of the woman she had always been. In front of her children and the man she had manipulated, she was simply a woman trapped in the consequences of her choices. "I'm sorry," Samira said, but the words sounded hollow. Samantha looked at Andres, who nodded slowly. The justice he had sought hadn't come through violence, but through the devastation of a truth that had finally been revealed. And so, with the weight of the revelations hanging in the room, they all knew that none of their lives would ever be the same again. The dawn arrived with a soft, golden light filtering through the curtains of Samantha's house. The storm that had engulfed her life in recent weeks seemed, at last, to be beginning to dissipate. The air inside the house was still tense, but there was a strange peace beginning to settle in her heart. After the devastating revelation of the previous night, there was something liberating in the rawness of the truth. Samantha, Andres, and Luis Ernesto stayed late, silently processing everything that had been said. There were no screams or violent confrontations, just a slow and painful acceptance of the inevitable. Samira, for her part, had retreated to her room, defeated, and for the first time in her life, without any plan to regain the control she had always wielded over others. Samantha was in the kitchen, making coffee, when Andres appeared at the door. Their relationship was still new, fragile, but there was a shared understanding that required no words. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her silently. Last night was intense, Andres finally said, breaking the silence. His voice sounded calmer, but also more vulnerable than ever. Samantha nodded, offering him a cup of coffee. Yes, it was, she replied, with a small smile. But maybe it was what we needed. The truth always comes to light, even when we've buried it so deeply. Andres took a sip of coffee, his eyes fixed on hers. For so many years, he had lived with resentment towards a family he had never known. But now, after confronting Samira and hearing everything she had hidden, something inside him began to heal. I never thought I could find any peace in all this, he admitted. But somehow, knowing the truth has given me more than I expected. Samantha looked at him, perfectly understanding his feelings. For so long, she had been trapped in a web of deceit, not really knowing who the people closest to her were. But now, despite the pain, she felt she could finally start rebuilding her life on solid ground. I think we've all been lost in some way, Samantha said. But now that everything has come to light, we can leave behind what's kept us chained and move forward. Andres smiled, a gesture rare for him, but one that revealed a hope even he hadn't expected to feel. And what are you going to do now? He asked, curious. Samantha sighed, looking out the window at the garden. The sun was rising slowly, casting a warm glow on the tree's leaves. I think I'll start again, she said with determination. This chapter of my life is over, and I don't want to be stuck in the past. I have so much to live for, and I want to do it differently. Andres nodded, understanding the depth of what she was saying. They were both at a crossroads, a moment where they could choose to keep carrying the wounds of the past or let them go and move on. At that moment, Luis Ernesto walked into the kitchen. He looked tired, but something about his posture had changed. He had spent the night reflecting on everything that had happened, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed genuinely remorseful. Samantha, Andres, he began, his voice softer than usual. I've been thinking a lot about all this, about what we've been through. And I know I've been part of the lies, of the manipulation, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. His gaze turned especially to Samantha. I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I want to make it right. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Samantha looked at him for a few seconds, evaluating his words. She had loved Luis Ernesto, but she had also felt the pain of his betrayal. Yet, despite everything, there was something in her that still wanted to see the best in him. No one is perfect, and although their relationship could never be what it once was, she knew that forgiveness was part of her own healing process. Luis Ernesto, she said softly. The path to redemption isn't easy, but if you're truly willing to change, maybe you can find your own forgiveness. I don't know if things between us can ever be like they were, but that doesn't mean you can't move forward. We all deserve a second chance if we really want it. Luis Ernesto nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, Samantha. I won't take it lightly. The atmosphere in the kitchen was heavy, but full of hope. There was still much to be resolved, but the three of them knew that the first step toward healing had already been taken. Later that day, Samantha decided to visit her mother. She knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation, but she also understood that she couldn't leave things as they were. Samira was sitting in her room, staring out the window with empty eyes, as if the life she had built had evaporated overnight. And in many ways, it had. Mom, Samantha said as she entered. Samira didn't respond immediately. After a few seconds, she finally spoke, her voice broken. I've destroyed everything, haven't I? Samira said, her words full of a sadness Samantha had never heard in her before. Samantha sat beside her, silent for a moment before responding. You've made mistakes, Mom. But you don't have to stay trapped in them forever. We can start again if you're willing to change. Samira looked at her, her eyes filled with tears. Is there still something left to fight for? She asked as if she didn't know the answer. Samantha took her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. There's always something to fight for, she replied. If you're willing to face yourself, to accept what you've done, then yes, Mom. You can still fix some things." Samira broke down crying, something Samantha had never seen before. It was the sobbing of a woman who, for the first time, understood the consequences of her actions. In that moment, Samantha knew her mother also had the right to seek her own redemption. The day passed slowly, but with a sense of relief. Despite the wounds, the lies, and the betrayals, the truth had come to light, and with it, the chance for a new beginning. Samantha, Andres, and Luis Ernesto knew that the future wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it, no longer as victims of the past, but as people who had chosen truth and forgiveness. As the sun set on the horizon, bathing the house in warm light, Samantha felt at peace. She had closed a painful chapter of her life, and although the scars would always remain, she now knew she was free to write her own destiny. A destiny filled with hope, learning, and the promise of a new beginning. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to leave in the comments what you felt while listening, and if you've experienced a similar situation of betrayal, I'd love for you to share your valuable opinion. I'd be honored if you leave a like, share the video with a friend or family member, and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next surprising story that's appearing on your screen right now. We have guaranteed entertainment exclusively for you. See you in the next video.